Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Danny Trejo at last gets to tell his own story in the documentary Inmate #1. The documentary follows actor Danny Trejo, who recalls how a rough childhood growing up in Pacoima, Los Angeles led to a life of crime and addiction that put him behind bars at the infamous San Quentin prison. After vowing to turn his life around and conquer his addictions, Trejo begins to be cast in bit parts in films, rising to cult stardom and leading roles such as Machete, but also continuing to serve as a role model of rehabilitation. Danny Trejo is one of the most distinctive character actors working today. He is instantly recognisable the moment that he steps on screen, and as such, audiences will very much recognise him from one of the hundreds of films that he's appeared in over the years, be it something like a Rodriguez film, or Anaconda, or Steven Seagal's Marked for Death, or even the likes of Eyeborgs or Gary Busey's Bulletproof. Trejo appears in anything and everything, and that's a large reason why he's built up such a cult following over the years. Trejo specialises in a certain kind of role. He usually plays things like thugs or henchmen or prison inmates, hence the title of this documentary, and that's because of his incredibly intimidating visage. It's because you take one look at him and immediately he lends a certain amount of credibility to a project. You know that at first glance he has lived every bit the life that he's portraying on screen, and that's why he's been so successful in Hollywood over the years. I think many film fans are at least partially aware of Trejo's story, but it was definitely a subject ripe for a documentary, and at long last, we finally get one. The film is directed by Brett Harvey, probably best known for the hockey documentary Ice Guardians, and essentially what he does is sit Trejo down to talk about his life in his own words. And I was very much looking forward to this documentary because Trejo is one of my favourite cult actors, but also I knew about some of the details of his story and I knew that it would be very captivating in its own right, and that proved to be extremely correct. Trejo's story is every bit as cinematic as one of the roles that he's portrayed on screen. Given that Trejo often works as a speaker, it should perhaps come as no surprise that he's a very charismatic subject that is full of stories to tell. Trejo is immediately disarming. He has a wide open smile and often cracks jokes as he's telling his tales, almost to give a sense of disbelief at all the various things that he's gone through during his life. Trejo is extremely charming and affable, but he's also very honest and candid at the same time, and that's why this documentary works as well as it does, because you get very little sense that Trejo is holding anything back here. This is warts and all, and I think that's because Trejo knows that by having those details in there, it makes his success at the end of it that much sweeter, but also I don't think he wants to lie about the person that he was, and I think that Harvey recognises that as a director. I think that he gets a very good measure of Trejo as a person over the course of this documentary, especially in the way that he shoots and edits Trejo's interview segments, because there'll be moments where Trejo turns a story into some kind of joke, as if to try and lighten the load and hide and mask that insecurity that's obviously still there, but Harvey lets it sit there just that beat longer, and you realise that just after he laughs, he cracks a little bit. You can tell that under the surface there's still a lot of pain there, and in that moment you realise that Trejo is a man that is always trying to reconcile the best and worst versions of himself, how the person that he was then is not the person that he is now, but he's someone that still feels like he has a lot to atone for and still has a lot to make up for in spite of all the things that he's done since. And I think that really gets the heart of the documentary. I think the reason why Trejo's story is so compelling is because technically it's two very familiar stories. It's both that of a redemption story, because you've got this criminal becoming a movie star, but also you've got this underdog story of someone coming from nothing to being one of the most recognisable people on the planet. Trejo rolls both those stories into one, so of course it makes for a great documentary. The first half of it definitely focuses on Trejo's upbringing in Pacoima and how he had a very turbulent childhood, and especially had a tense relationship with his father, who was very tough and unemotional, which led Trejo to lash out. He began to see the appeal of his uncle Gilbert, who was a criminal and a thief, but also an addict, and he wanted to follow in his uncle's footsteps, and literally did just that by accompanying him to various stick-ups over the course of several years. And some of the stories that Trejo tells are just simply incredible, about how he'd have times where he'd had a gun that wouldn't hold itself together, so he's using his hand to keep it together while pointing it at someone's face, or walking into somewhere with a grenade and just pulling the pin out. These stories are outrageous, and they do have a certain level of dark humour to them, but they're also very bleak, and some of the stories that Trejo tells are deeply disturbing, especially about how he became addicted to heroin from a very young age. He talks about his first encounter and how he OD'd and how he very nearly died at that moment. And that's one of the things that really stuck out to me over the course of this documentary. Trejo talks about how the criminal life either drives you crazy or gets you killed. And there are numerous moments over the course of this documentary where Trejo very, very narrowly squeaks past death. You can tell how things could have gone very, very differently in the blink of an eye. Trejo is an exceptionally lucky individual, and it really shows, especially in stories about how he got shivved in prison, but luckily he had the forethought to put some magazines wrapped up underneath his clothing to make sure that the shiv didn't actually get him. And that's the world that he was in. And as Trejo talks about this period in his life, you realise that he's getting deeper and deeper into this world. He is in a spiral, even if he doesn't think that he needs help. It's inevitable then that he ends up behind bars. He ends up in San Quentin, one of the most infamous prisons in America, as well as having stints in fairly infamous institutions in their own right, like Folsom. And once he's in prison, it becomes a life of violence, because once you're in that hostile environment, you have to prove that you are the toughest person there, because otherwise you are a victim and you are vulnerable. And it just simply becomes a matter of survival. It becomes a matter of having to do terrible, terrible things just to endure it. And you can tell that Trejo has done and seen things that will haunt him for the rest of his life. And that really gets across how scary it genuinely is. And it also shows how remarkable that Trejo still had a very formidable reputation. Trejo particularly knew how to box, and as such became a champion in San Quentin, and that at least gave him some degree of solace whilst he was behind bars. But nevertheless, you can tell that over time, Trejo was beginning to weary of that cycle of violence and realising what his life had become. And Harvey emphasises this in his direction by having a lot of B-roll footage of Trejo walking around in prison, glowering at the camera, which sells the words that he is saying, even if there isn't a lot of footage to accompany it. Once Trejo decides to change his ways, he becomes a catalyst for good. He realises that he can help himself by helping others, and in turn opening up opportunities that he never thought possible, and that's how he ends up in the film world. It almost seems like he was destined to be there, considering how much he used to watch John Wayne films as a child, and he talks about how much he admired him and wanted to be him, but also how he used the Wizard of Oz as a way of keeping his sanity in solitary confinement by reciting the entire movie there. But it was only working as a drugs counsellor did he end up on the set of the movie Runaway Train, where they needed someone to help train and spar with Eric Roberts, and that's how he ended up in that movie, and his career snowballed from there. And while this was the side of the documentary that I was a lot more familiar with, it's still entertaining to hear Trejo talk about all these various anecdotes and hearing the stories come from the horse's mouth. And if you like Trejo's work, it's a lot of fun to see this highlight reel of all of his most memorable roles. They talk about a lot of his various key performances in films like, say, Desperado, which kicked off a long-standing relationship with Rodriguez, who turned out to be his second cousin by marriage. But also, there are some stories here that I'd never heard previously, like the time that he was on Death Wish 4 and had to deal with an actor who was being a bit of a prima donna in their method performance, or especially Heat, because it turns out that his performance in that film is very deeply personal in a number of different ways. The second half of the documentary does start to get a little bit more episodic because obviously we're picking through various roles. It does start to feel like we're skimming through his IMDb page, but nevertheless, it is still a pleasure in revisiting all these various parts. The movie also convincingly makes the argument that Trejo has a versatility that is somewhat underappreciated and may well be the key to his enduring success. Trejo manages to work his way up from playing unnamed heavies to characters that actually get names to eventually becoming the leading man with Machete when Rodriguez makes a vehicle tailored for him out of the huge crowd reaction to the fake trailer that was attached to Grindhouse. And that only goes to show how much Trejo is beloved. Trejo really does turn around from being someone who is feared to someone who is admired, and it is really wonderful to watch him succeed and flourish in the way that he has, and this documentary shows just how much that he has gone to prove that he can break down the barriers that have been placed for people like him. I think that he really is a true success story, but most of all we get a real sense of his generosity and his tireless dedication even into his 70s now. This is someone who has well over 300 credits on IMDb, on way to 400, to the extent that even Danny admits that there are times where he's on a set and he doesn't know what the film is, but he's just happy to be there. He's happy to just keep giving back. This is someone that has never forgotten where they've come from. He still lives in Pacoima in the same house that he grew up in and still giving back to that community and making up for the debt that he feels he still owes. And alongside his acting work, also acting as a speaker and a counsellor as well. He really does do as many things as possible. He has an incredible life, and you really get to see this in the documentary. I do think the last stretch of it that really focuses upon this does drag out a little bit too long. It feels like a very extended epilogue, and I don't think it helps that it feels the most like a motivational speech, especially because there's a lot of inspirational music in the background that is a little bit overbearing here. It's a small issue with the documentary. Otherwise, I think that Harvey does a really good job helming the movie. I think that, in general, the documentary is very slickly produced. There's also a lot of contributions from Trejo's family, friends, and co-stars, including Michelle Rodriguez, Rod Rodriguez, Cheech Marin, and Donal Logue, and they all have very worthwhile things to say and add, but the focus is very squarely on Danny, as it should be. If I did have some gripes with the overall helmsmanship of the documentary, it's only relatively small things, like I think there's a little bit too much B-roll footage worked in there. I think that it would have been better if we held on Trejo more than we do sometimes and really register the emotions on his face. I also think that occasionally the movie uses film clips sourced from YouTube with the odd watermark on there, which does feel a little bit sloppy sloppy at times. These are relatively small complaints in the grand scheme of things. This is very much a documentary that is worthy of its subject. I really enjoyed Inmate number 1. Whether you're a fan of Danny Trejo or just simply have a passing interest in him, it's well worth watching. It's a remarkable life story, very well told by Trejo himself. While it is fun to revisit all of his signature parts, the documentary is genuinely powerful because you get a real sense of his accomplishments and what he's managed to overcome that gives you a newfound appreciation for him. And I think it only really goes to show the power of changing one's mindset to embrace kindness and positivity over violence and hostility, and Trejo is perhaps the ultimate example of rehabilitation and how change really can happen if you choose to embrace it. And as such, while the documentary does have some very dark moments in it, ultimately I found it very uplifting. If you like this review, then you can support my work over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.